On this lecture, we're going to talk about the decision to strike and two separate models that are used to do that. Now, strikes and lockouts can be very costly tactics for both sides during the bargaining process. So we're going to spend some time looking at the decision to strike, what goes into that process. So during a strike, or as a result of a strike, only one side can make themselves better off. Sometimes both sides are even made worse off. So your text gives the example of a pie being split between union and management. Strikes by definition are costly. It's going to impose costs on at least one side or both sides. That's why the tactic is used. So it's going to shrink the size of the pie overall. When a strike occurs, both the union and the management is hoping that they can increase the size of their slice to be greater than it was before. Now, in order to do that with the whole pie shrinking, to make them better off, they're going to have to take something at the expense of the other side. So even though they have the smaller pie, they can still gain something compared to where they were before. The problem is that often both sides are going to suffer some loss. If both sides understand the risk, and since they often understand the risk, which is evidenced by the fact that they typically purchase insurance and offer those strike benefits. If that's the case, then why do strikes ever occur? If they both know that they can be costly, as evidenced by the fact that they take something to try to minimize those costs when they do happen. J.R. Hicks developed a simple model to help us understand the decision-making process. Now, this can explain any of the type of disagreements that firms and unions will have, or as management and unions will have. It could be working conditions, working hours, the number of laborers, etc. What we're going to focus on here is wage as the example, because its relationship to costs are the clearest. So let's suppose that initially unions want a wage at point A, while management is only willing to pay a wage of B. So in this case, there's going to be a significant gap between the two. Something that's the demands made by each side is going to upset the other side because they're far enough apart. In this case, if a strike would occur, the union would be willing to budge on their wage demand and be willing to accept lower and lower wages as the strike drags on and it becomes more and more costly. We can call this the union's concession curve. After their wage demand drops to point A, over time, it's going to drop down to C, which is the midpoint between the two wages in negotiation. And eventually, it's going to fall even further. We can see the same thing going on reverse for the management, for the employer concession curve. Eventually, the wage you're going to offer, it starts slow, and it slowly increases over time as the strike drags on and on. So using this model we see in figure 12.3 here on the slide, we would expect the strike to last in time until the time S1. At that point, the union and the management are willing to agree on the same wage. At any time before S1, in this case S0, but at any point there to the left of S1, the union's wage demands are going to exceed the wage that management is willing to pay. So the strike is going to extend until they meet, in this case at wage W1 at point C. Now, the idea of bargaining power that we've talked about can shed further light on the forces that lead to the bargaining impasses, so lead to these strikes and to the resolution of strikes. In practice, the union will not know the wage that management is willing to pay and what their concession curve actually looks like. And management won't know the same thing for the union. So if both sides had full information, they could compromise before the strike occurred. Now, this is why negotiations typically use either neutral third parties or independent fact checkers to try to gather as much information as possible to improve the negotiation process so that we don't see these types of strikes occurring. Now, another model of strikes comes from Ashenfelter, who I mentioned so much, might as well have used his textbook. So Ashenfelter and Johnson, who developed this theory, argued that there are three parties we need to consider. So it's not just the union and the employer. You have the employer and the management, but you also have the rank and file union members and the union leaders. So this makes sense. Union leaders, like all leaders really, have their own interests, which they have to take into account as well. So union leaders and rank and file members often have the same interests, but in some cases they're going to diverge. And in this is important to understand the strike decision. If the members' wage expectations or their demands are too unrealistic, leaders have three options. They can try to convince them to lower their demands to be more realistic. They could sign a collective bargaining agreement that is lower than the members want, or they could call a strike. So trying to convince them to lower their demands or to sign a collective bargaining agreement that the members don't want is going to be career suicide for union leaders. So in this case, union leadership is basically forced to call a strike, even though they know it's unrealistic. Sometimes when this occurs, and this is what drives strikes, and especially costly strikes, because the rank and file union members think they can get much more than is really accurate or really possible. So we end up with these long drawn out strikes.